Chapter 2 of Baruch Spinoza's book. Um, Now, in chapter 1, we looked at it covers prophecy. So it's about what prophecy is and what is not prophecy. Yeah, that's what chapter 1 is about. Chapter 2 is about now the prophets themselves. Um, Baruch Spinoza tries to make us have a clear understanding of the nature of the prophets. And in particular, he tries to make us realize that they were humans with shortcomings, because at least it seems his view was that often it was lost to the people who believed in the prophets that these were humans and they were not perfect. So while the message they passed was powerful messages, often it is always it's always better if someone takes it with the understanding that these were humans and they had their own shortcomings. And that's what he tries to explain in chapter 2, generally speaking. Now, he starts by telling us that prophets were mostly endowed with unusual, vivid imaginations. So often the message they passed came from their imagination. And while that is good, that is a gift they had, there is a problem with that. According to Baruch Spinoza, there is a problem with that. Um, and he said these imaginations was not always accurate or correct. And in fact, he goes on to show us how this prophecy was supposed to be very cautious when believing them, even when they are in the Bible. And he uses the Bible itself to illustrate this. And I found that to be very smart. He also tells us that it wasn't a requirement that a prophet needed to be an intellectual. In fact, he tells us when you look at the Bible, some of the most intellectual individuals mentioned in the Bible were not prophets. For example, he tells us that Solomon was considered to be one of the wisest men or people, but he wasn't described as a prophet. He's never been listed as one of the prophets. Because he wasn't considered to have that faculty of prophecy, which basically translates to he wasn't as imaginative. And Baruch tells us that intellectuals have a difficulty of becoming prophets because they are the knowledge. They basically have this thing that bars them. They understand they shouldn't let the imaginative faculty to go overboard. So that becomes like something that prevents them from exploring with the imaginative faculty. So he tells us the lectures in the Bible, there's people like Solomon who are considered very wise. They were never considered prophets. And then we have people who were uneducated countrymen and women that are mentioned in the Bible as prophets. And he gives us an example of Hagar, who was Abraham's handmaid, and she was considered a prophet. So I read, he says that to suppose that knowledge of natural and spiritual phenomena can be gained from prophetic books is an utter mistake, which I shall endeavor to expose, as I think philosophy, the age, and the question itself demand. So he says, because prophets, it wasn't a requirement for them to be intellectual, and because most of whatever message they passed came from imagination, it's a mistake to believe that we can learn from them everything. Like, yeah, we can learn from their prophetic messages, but we should be careful. We should be aware that there are limitations. So it goes on to say, I care not. Okay, this paragraph appears in chapter 2. It's kind of like out of place. That's what I thought reading it. But it brings out Baruch Spinoza's problem with religion. Because for him, the problem, in fact, when you read the entire book, the problem that Spinoza has with religion is not religion per se. Is how religion is used. That's where his problem is. And he thinks there is too much superstition in religion. And he thinks that superstition is the problem. And he says, I'm reading, I care not for the guardings of superstition, for superstition is the bitter enemy of all true knowledge and true morality. So his position was that superstition is the enemy of true knowledge and true morality. which, if you think about it, kind of makes sense. Sometimes religion through superstition can make people do very moral things, and they justify them because of religion. They can kill mass murders, and they'll be like, yeah, God said, or whatever. And then it can also be an enemy to true knowledge. People can be prevented from acquiring knowledge because of religion. It happens a lot. It has happened a lot through human history, and it's still happening in some parts of the world where true knowledge and science, whatever, are kind of curtailed because people believe that's knowledge that's going against their beliefs. He says, I continue reading, yes, it has come to this, men who openly confess that they can form no idea of God and only know him through created things of which they know not the causes, can unblushingly accuse philosophers of atheism. So he says, people who fall into these superstitions don't want to understand God by looking at the bigger picture. And these are the people who accuse others of being atheists. And I have to mention that this paragraph itself shows that Baruch was not an atheist. And in fact, seems like he didn't have, he had a low opinion of atheists. So it doesn't make sense to accuse him of being one of them. Yeah. I will show that prophecies varied. So now, the big thing in chapter 2 is Baruch showing us how the nature of the prophet themselves, their social standing, their location, their knowledge, like where they grew up, had a lot of influence on the kind of prophecy that they ended up providing, and even the mood in which they were. So the prophecy will come out. If they are happy, they'll give different prophecy. If they are sad and moody, melancholy, they'll give a different kind of prophecy. I found this part very interesting, which is like it's trying to show that you should be careful when you take these prophecies, because some of them is given based on the place that the prophet themselves were. Like prophecy is as much a product of the prophet and their environment and who they are as a person. So it's not like prophecy should be removed and set aside from the person who's giving it. That's what basically Baruch is trying to tell us in chapter 2, that the prophet is important. The messenger is as important as the message. So I'll read. I'll show that prophecies varied not only according to the imagination and physical temperament of the prophet, but also according to his particular opinions, and further that the prophecy never rendered the prophet wiser than he was before. Yeah, so the last part of that paragraph is made me think for a moment. Like the prophecy never made the prophet wiser than he was before they received the prophecy. They remain to be the same person. But I continue reading. But I will first discuss the assurance of truth which the prophet received, for this is akin to the subject matter of the chapter, and I will serve to elucidate somewhat our present point. Now, of course, that's what it does in chapter 2. There's something he mentions after that is trying to prove that prophecy was not always accurate, or most of the time, not every prophecy that came was accepted just face value. And he uses the Bible to show us this. In the Bible, there is this line that occurs a lot: show me a sign. Show me a sign. I've even had some songs with lyrics with that line, show me a sign. So the prophets themselves will doubt when they have these visions, and they'll pray to God, Lord, show me a sign so that I know it is you speaking to me and I'm not getting things from other places. So that alone proves that even the prophets themselves knew that they will have these visions, and some of these visions will turn out to be wrong according to them. So there is that aspect of show me a sign. I read what Spinoza says. In this respect, prophetic knowledge is inferior to natural knowledge, which needs no sign and in itself implies certitude. Like there this line of show me a sign in the Bible. But when it comes to ordinary knowledge, let's say scientific knowledge is self-evident, is self-proving for the most part. Like it can be given to somebody else and they can still go through it and come to the same conclusion and be like, yeah, this seems like it is like, and if it's wrong, other people can easily prove it's wrong. But for prophetic knowledge, other people cannot prove whether it's wrong or not, often. most cases. They just have to accept it the way it is. They have to accept that you saw God and God told you this and that is it. They have no mechanism of proving whether that is true or not for the most part. And that's why, as Baruch says, based on that alone, prophetic knowledge is inferior to natural knowledge. Moreover, scripture warrants the statement that the certitude of the prophets was not mathematical but moral. Moses lays down the punishment of death for prophets who preaches new gods, even though he confirmed his doctrine by signs and wonders. So, when you read the Bible itself, it's so interesting. Of course, I've come to this, but he points it out for me, and it occurs to me right now. Okay, that's interesting. I've never thought about it like that. Like, if you read the Bible, there are places in the Bible where prophets are acknowledged to be prophets, and they can do wonders, they can show miracles and things like that. But then they are again said to be not of God. And in this case, it tells us that Moses ended up giving punishment of death to prophets who he accused of preaching other gods, even though they did wonders. And that's in Deuteronomy somewhere. For he says, the Lord also worketh signs and wonders to try his people. That is the excuse that is given there, that sometimes wonders are done by those who are sent to try people, like to deceive them. Also, Jesus Christ warns his disciples of the same thing in Matthew, I think, 23:24. And also furthermore, Ezekiel plainly states that God sometimes deceives men with false revelations, and Micaiah bears like witness in the case of prophets of Ahab. So there are these prophets that are mentioned in the Bible, or are alluded to, who can do miracles, and when they stand before you, they can say things that you'll be like, yeah, that's very prophetic. But then others accuse them of being false prophets, or even though they can do wonders, then you are told those are not of God. So Spinoza uses this to prove that the messenger was as important as the message. Like, don't just take the message and ignore who said it. It was important. Who said it was important. Even if they did wonders or they passed prophetic messages that was so powerful, it was still important who this person saying it was and what was their condition. So it says, prophecy also varied according to disposition in this way. If a prophet was cheerful, victories, peace, and events which make men glad were revealed to him, in that he was naturally more likely to imagine such things. If on the contrary he was melancholy, wars, massacres, and calamities were revealed, and so according as a prophet was merciful, gentle, quick to anger, or severe, he was more fitted for one kind of revelation than another. It varied according to the temper of imagination in this way. If a prophet was cultivated, he perceived the mind of God in a cultivated way. If he was confused, he perceived it confusedly, and so with revelation perceived through visions. If a prophet was a countryman, he saw visions of oxen, cows, and the like. If he was a soldier, he saw generals and army. If he was a courtier, he saw a royal throne, and so on. So basically, Baruch is telling us that the nature or the surrounding of a prophet and who they were as a person influenced the messages that they passed, the things that they imagined and told people. So it wasn't like the message was completely detached from who they were and their personal experiences. Most of these messages were attached to their own personal experiences. He also said prophecy varied according to the opinion held by the prophet. So they had biases, and Baruch is of the opinion that we have to acknowledge these biases, and beyond biases, he says that the style of prophecy also varied according to eloquence of the individual prophet. Some were more eloquent than others. But even more important, the prophets were ignorant on different matters. And he says, he used the Bible to prove this, that sometimes people read the prophets and whatever the prophets say, and they think the prophets knew everything. They were knowledgeable in everything, in every matter. But he says, no, often they were very ignorant and they said things that they didn't even understand. And they got things wrong because of their ignorance. And he gives us the example of Joshua. And he tells us that Joshua, and perhaps the person who wrote the book of Joshua, he says that Joshua, and perhaps also the author who wrote his history, thought that the sun revolves around the earth, and the earth is fixed, and further the sun for a certain period remains still. because that's something that is described in the Bible, in the book of Joshua. I think that he describes that the sun went around the earth, which we now know not to be the case. After many thousands of years, scientists have studied. Now, nobody questions that. Everybody agrees the sun is still and the earth moves around the sun. Now, if it were the case that these prophets could somehow, through their imagination, find reality without knowing about them, then Joshua would have known or would have received the understanding or the knowledge that the sun is still. But he didn't, meaning then their ignorance came into the message, that the ignorance was part of the message, basically. So the message they gave would only be as accurate, as knowledgeable as the prophet was. That's what Baruch is trying to say. He also gives us the example of Solomon. He says, we are not bound to believe that Solomon was a mathematician. We may affirm that he was ignorant of the true ratio between the circumference and the diameter of a circle, and that, like the generality of workmen, he thought it was as 3:1. So Solomon describes dimensions of the temple. I think that's where this comes from. And while doing it, he makes a mathematical error that then most people did not know. But over time, as people have become more, people have discovered more, especially around mathematics, they've come to realize he made a huge error in terms of the diameter of a circle and the circumference. And if indeed this came from God, as it is claimed, we assume God would know about this, and that message would have come accurate. Maybe then the people would not have understood it, but over time they would have been proven, yeah, it is true, it has to be like that. But now it is the other way around. There is an error that is proven to be an error over time. I continue reading. We have determined then that we are only bound to believe in the prophetic writings, the object and substance of the revelation. With regard to the details, everyone may believe or not as they like. So it's basically saying we need to take the prophetic messages with a pinch of salt, with the understanding that the prophets were not intellectuals, with the understanding that the prophets were relying on the imaginations, which we cannot take to be accurate. And with the understanding that this, whatever they imagined, was based on their personal experience, who they were, where they lived, and their ignorance also came in that imagination. But it doesn't rule out, it doesn't say like there's nothing to learn from the prophecy completely. It just says we can pick some things out of it, especially when it comes to morality and things like that. But we need to be careful about the details.